Hi, Ben Johnson here to record the activities that we completed during the second day of our Excel class. Let's go ahead and download that file. So you'll just go to bit.ly/psdexcel. It'll take you to this Google spreadsheet. You can go to Drills 2000 Part 2, download those, save them in a location where you can find them, and then open them at the bottom of your browser. And then that file will launch in Excel. The second day we spent most of the time working on formulas and functions, which is something that Excel is really good at doing. If you get the shallow bar, just enable editing on the top. Now this first spreadsheet is not necessarily the way that you usually see Excel used, but I wanted to get you used to the concept of typing in formulas and functions. So go ahead and click in B1. And one thing you need to know about Excel is that every formula or function always starts with an equal sign, so it's always equals. You can type plain numbers into the addresses like I've got here, 1, 2, 3. This is not traditionally the way you use Excel, but it's a good starting place. So I've got equals 1 plus 2 plus 3, and I can press enter and it's going to give me 6. So I can make Excel work just like a calculator just by typing equals 10 plus 20 plus 30. Normally you'll see those numbers typed in cells instead of in the formula itself, and I'll show you that on the next step. But I wanted to show you that you can use Excel like a calculator. Now the advantage of doing that is when you click on these, you can actually see the numbers you typed. Whereas on a calculator, if you mistype something, you may not realize it. It's hard to see what you typed in. To subtract numbers, very much the same. 1 plus 10 minus 6. Multiplication uses an asterisk, equals 4 times 4. Division uses a forward slash, equals 20 divided by 10. By the way, these are turning green because of conditional formatting that I applied to the cells. Normally your spreadsheet won't turn green on its own. Think back to your 6th grade math class where you learned about the order of operation, and that was basically multiplication and division happens first, and then addition and subtraction second. And so in Excel, you may need to group things together using parentheses. So if I wanted to group these together, I can do equals parentheses 4 times 4. It's going to force those to be grouped together. Then divide by 2 second. In this next example, you can actually nest your parentheses. And so if I do equals, and nesting requires 2 levels of parentheses. So I'm going to do the 4 times 4, subtract the 2, and that's the second level of nesting, and then times 3. Now if I didn't use these parentheses, what would happen is 2 times 3 would happen first, and we would have a different answer. So parentheses are really important. By the way, you can use them in formulas and functions, and you'll see that here in a minute. So these are the operators that you'll use when you're typing your own formulas in. An exponent is this up arrow that's on your 6 key. So there are a few others that you can use in addition to the ones shown here. All right, now this is more typical of what your formulas will look like in Excel. So if I want to get the September total, I'll again start with equals, but instead of typing the numbers 2 plus 15 plus 12, I'll actually type the cell addresses D3 plus E3 plus F3. And you can see, even though I'm typing them in lowercase, it's going to work. Then I just press enter. But notice that I type the cell addresses instead of the actual numbers, and I'll end up with the same result. The advantage of this is if one of these numbers changes, I don't have to change the formula. It will just automatically fix itself. Whereas if you had typed these numbers in, you would actually have to go and change the number. Now you can practice doing that with October and November if you'd like the extra practice. If you feel like you have it down, you can just go ahead and autofill that equation down. These didn't turn green because I copied the formatting with it, so don't worry if those don't turn green. Now, you can imagine if you had more than 2 or 3 numbers, to add them one at a time with the cell addresses would be tedious. So the people that wrote Excel came up with these functions, and they're just an efficient way to save time. and there's hundreds of them. The most commonly used one is the sum function, and you can just type in equals sum. There's a faster way to do this in a bit, which I'll show you, but for now let's just do it the old-fashioned way. D3 colon D5, and remember that's a range. We talked about that in the first session. So that D3 through D5, that's a range, and that is again going to save you time. If you're adding up more than a couple of numbers, it's always more efficient to just use that sum function. Okay, and you could practice that under paper and plastic. Once you understand how to write this function, you can just go ahead and autofill that across. Alright, so let's look at click on cells. While you can manually type the names of the cell addresses, it's less likely to make mistakes if you actually type on them. So I can do that with a September. I can do equals. I can click on the 2, click on the 15, click on the 12, and that's a more reliable way than typing those addresses. If you type them, you're likely to make a mistake. And again, you can practice that with October and November, or just simply autofill that down. I can do the same thing with the sum function. I can do equals sum parenthesis. Then I can just use my mouse to highlight the numbers that I want to add. And again, I can practice that with paper and plastic, or I can just autofill that across. Alright, the sum function, it turns out, is used so frequently it actually has its own button right on the menu. So let's go ahead and add up September. So up here on your home ribbon is the AutoSum button. You just simply click that. Excel guesses what you're adding. It writes the entire function for you, and all you have to do is just verify that it's correct and press the enter button on your keyboard. And you can practice doing that again. You can autofill that down once you're confident with the AutoSum button. If you'd like to try that with cans, paper, and plastic, you can do the same thing. Should Excel guess wrong? For instance, if I hit AutoSum here, it wanted to add the numbers above. That's the default. I actually want to add the numbers here, so I can just use my mouse, highlight the correct addresses, and then press enter. So should Excel ever guess wrong, just use your mouse and highlight the correct cells. In this spreadsheet, the average form, I'm going to show you how you can use a function with a formula. So let's go ahead and add up our cans here. So I'll hit my AutoSum. Guessed right, I hit enter. But I wanted the average, not the total. So I can come up here to the formula bar, and I can just divide by 3. And in this case, I've combined a function, the sum function, along with just a plain old formula like divide by 3. Sometimes you need to combine a formula and a function, and they'll work together as long as you type them in correctly. Alright, average function. Just like the sum function, the writers of Excel realize there's a more efficient way to do that, because it knows there's 3 numbers here, and so it ought to be smart enough to know how to average those 3 numbers. So if I come up here to my AutoSum, you can see average is in the drop-down list, and the function just looks like equals average D3 through D5. You'll notice it never says divide by 3, because that is actually built into the function, which is what makes it efficient. And then I press enter, and then I can just autofill that across. Okay, and so that's the average function. Besides the sum function, the average function is probably the second most popular function in Excel, and there are hundreds of functions in Excel. Googling the function and then finding a nice YouTube video on how to use it is typically what I'll do when I'm ready to use a function that's new to me. The if function is one of my favorites because it will allow your spreadsheet to do some thinking for you, and you don't have to sit there and look through a bunch of numbers to maybe assign students to a particular class or something. So in this case, I'll just look at the recycling numbers, and I'll tell students whether they did a good job or they need to work harder. So I'll just click in my H3, and you can look here, and if is not in this list, so you can go to more functions, or you can click the FX button here on the toolbar, which is how I access those additional functions. It's just a faster less clicking, so I'll hit FX. If may already be in your list. If so, you can just select it. If it's not, you can search for it up here in the search box. I'll just hit OK. Excel brings up almost a little wizard to guide you through that function. And the very first thing you have to do is click on the cell that you're evaluating. In this case, it's G3. And I want to see maybe if it's greater than 30, so I'll just type in greater than 30. It could be less than or equal to. Just using those operators. It already knows that's false because it's 29, so it tells me that. If it's true, what I want to tell the students, maybe great job. Then I'll tab down, and for false I'll say try harder next month. Then if I tab out of there, you'll notice that it puts quotes around the text, and again, Excel needs to treat text differently than numbers or formulas, and so that's why it will put those quotes on it. If you'd like to look at what the formula or the function would look like if you typed it manually, you can look here at the formula bar. The function is if. Inside of these parentheses are our arguments. This is the logical test. Separate the first argument with a comma. This is our true argument. Separate it with a comma, and then finally our false argument, and then we can just hit OK. And so Excel knows that this is less than 30, so it's going to print try harder next month, and I can autofill that down. And you can see our spreadsheet is doing the thinking for us. Now, if one of these numbers changes, it will automatically adjust that if response, that if true statement. And so in that way, your spreadsheet is thinking for you. And so this is very useful, for instance, if maybe you're trying to place students into a particular math class based on a test score. So if they have a low test score, you could place them into a consumer math maybe. If they've got a high test score, you can put them into algebra. And so that's typically how you'll see that. But you could imagine if you had 5,000 students and you needed to evaluate those students manually one at a time, it would take a lot of time and you may make a lot of mistakes. So using an if function to do some thinking, make your spreadsheet think for you, is really powerful. And in my experience, that if function is kind of maybe like the third most frequently used function, which is sort of surprising that it's not up here in this list. I guess probably just because it's a little bit more complicated, but one of my favorites. This new version of Excel has an ifs function. We'll look at it one of the future nights, but it's going to allow you to have more than just a true false. It allows you to have as many trues as you'd like, and so we'll take a look at that in a future class. Conditional formatting is a great tool. I'll just have you use some of your autofill skills over here. Maybe to have a chance to practice this. So I just have some different numbers here, and let's see if I can. I'll just autofill a few columns here. And now what the neat thing about the conditional formatting is that visually we can make these numbers easy to understand. So I could highlight them all at once, or I could highlight one column at a time and then just come up here to my home ribbon, and I can go to highlight cells based on rules and write my own rules manually, which is kind of what I did with the cells that have been turning green. Or I can use these color scales, and that's my preference whenever possible, is just to use these color scales. And there's lots of different kinds of color scales that you can choose from, and data bars too, or icon sets that are really helpful. So I'll just go ahead and show you a few of these, and they're all under this conditional formatting. And again, if you want to write your own rules, you would use the highlight cell rules, and then you can write your own rules. But using these pre-written ones are really helpful, and so I'll just again show you what that might look like. So these are all different conditional formatting. And so a lot of times if you have a spreadsheet with a lot of numbers on there and you just want people to quickly identify which students are doing poorly or well. This is just a really quick visual way to get that sense of that. So I like to use conditional formatting whenever I can to make my spreadsheets a bit faster to interpret. All right, autofill formulas. As you saw before, we can write this formula and we can autofill it across. Works great. We have all yellow smiley faces, all the correct answers. I want you to take a look at what that does. So when I autofill this, it equals sum C4 through C6. Then you can see when I autofill it, it automatically changes that range to D4 through D6, E4 through E6. And so Excel, when you autofill a formula or function, it will automatically adjust that formula or function relative from where it was copied. So if it was copied 1 over to the right, it's going to adjust all of the cell addresses 1 over to the right, and that's why we got all the correct answers here. And that's usually a good thing. That's usually what you want to have happen. It usually saves you a lot of time. However, there are some instances where you don't want Excel to automatically adjust formulas and functions based on where you're copying them from, and I'll just show you on this next exercise absolute formulas. So here we've got a spreadsheet with some of our meals and our tip rate here, and we want to calculate the tip that we're going to leave. And so we would just write a formula like equals this number times this number. And our first meal, we get a tip of 380. It looks good. We decide we want to be efficient and just autofill that down. And all of a sudden, we realize we have a big problem. No tip here, a $2,000 tip here, a $300 tip here. So let's see what happened. Equals B3 times B1. That's right. Let's look at our no tip. Equals B4. That's the price of meal 2 times B2. Well, there's no tip here. You can see that it adjusted that formula down 1 when we actually didn't want it to. Look at the $2,000 tip equals B5. That's the cost of the third meal, times B3, which is actually the cost of the first meal here, and that's why we end up leaving a $2,000 tip, which is not what we want. So if you think about this, the B3, the meals are moving down the spreadsheet, but the tip rate doesn't. And so we can force Excel to do what's called an absolute reference by putting dollar signs in front of that B and in front of the 1. And so we end up with equals B3 times $B, $1. And so to make an absolute reference, you put a dollar sign before the letter and the number. The fact that we're using dollar signs here has nothing to do with the fact that this is a money spreadsheet. We would use dollar signs even if it was a grade book with test scores. So we press enter, and we still get the 380, but now when we autofill this down, we get better tip amounts that we can live with. And you can see this first cell changes as you go down the page, but the B1 doesn't, and that's because of those dollar signs. Now there's another way to make absolute reference that some people like. And so if I click on this 15%, I can see it's in cell B9. Now if I want to, I can just change the name of that cell to tip rate, one word, all lowercase, press enter. So cell B9 no longer exists, it's now tip rate. And so as long as I refer to that cell as tip rate, it's the equivalent of using those dollar signs. It's going to make a absolute reference. Now if I autofill this down, I should get these same numbers, and you can see that it leaves that tip rate. So 2 ways to make an absolute reference. Either using the dollar signs or renaming the cell a word, and then Excel knows to treat that as a special absolute cell. All right, I'm going to just take a quick look at this sum if, and later you'll see that we can use a pivot table to replace this, but I just want to show you that in some cases you can, some of these functions end up getting combined into a single function to really make them efficient, and so SUMIF is one of those. And so we've got some sales here and our 3 people, and we want to look up their sales. And in fact, to make this work better, I'll just go ahead and type in the people's name here. All right, so As I said before, how would you learn about these functions? You could Google them, find a nice video where somebody explains. If you don't know enough of what to even Google, you can go to a website like Mr. Excel and ask a question there, and lots of nice people all over the world will help tell you what function to use. In this case, we want to do a sum if, basically based on the name and the amount. Now, in order for this to work, I'm going to go ahead and name these ranges so that we can just auto-fill that formula down and not have to worry about doing those absolute references. So I'll just name this range. I'll just call this one sales, and then this one I'll call it names. Whoops. I meant to type names up here in the cell address, and then you just press enter. Okay, now I can use my SUMIF to write the function. So I can again just go up to my FX button, search for a SUMIF, and then I can hit OK. And it's going to bring up this little dialog box, sort of wizard. The range is going to ask, where are my names at? Well, they're in this range that I called names. Criteria, what name are we looking for? Well, we're looking for Bob, and if I just click on A23, that's going to be the equivalent of typing Bob, but a little better because I'll be able to autofill that down to pick up Beth and Susan here in a second. And then the sum range, where are my numbers? Well, I call that sales, I believe, so it gives me a nice preview there. Then I just hit OK. And so it just checked this list, and wherever it found a sale for Bob, it just totaled it up and put it here. Now, because of the way I wrote this formula, I can go ahead and autofill this down, and it should give me Beth and Susan sales. And the reason that works is I named that range names and sales, and so when I autofilled that down one, it didn't move that down one. Same with Susan here. Again, it just looked for the names, it looked for the sales, and then it looked for her name here in A25, and it gave me these nice subtotals. So like I said, there's hundreds of functions in Excel that can do some amazing things, especially around finance, like making an amortization table for a mortgage, that sort of thing. Again, if you don't know how to use those functions, Google them, and there's lots of nice YouTube videos out there that will explain how to use them. And then if you don't know what to even Google, then you can go to Mr. Excel or a discussion forum and ask there for suggestions on what function to use. And eventually you'll find the one you want to use. You can watch a YouTube video to learn how to use it, and in large part that's how people learn how to use Excel now. So that's sort of wraps up our second class, and then in our next class we'll spend a lot of time on pivot tables, and pivot tables actually do what you saw here automatically on their own without having to write any functions. They're very powerful. So thanks for watching the second day, and then we'll get the third day recorded next.